like and subscribe. What is something shocking you found out about a friend or family member after they died? This isn't shocking, more cute. My granddad was a farmer his whole life. Every animal loved him. We'd go to a new place and dogs would be coming straight to him, horses would cuddle with him. He just had a charm with them. When cleaning out his closet and digging in his pockets to make sure nothing of value was thrown in the wash, we found grains, bits of dried meats, dog treats, bits of old carrot for the horses. Man's been bribing animals with food all this his life. My great-grandfather had not, in fact, been eaten by a bear on Mount Rainier. He was a park ranger. Instead, he had been cheating on my great-grandmother and was summarily run out of town by her brothers. He moved to Alaska and nobody knew what had become of him until we located his grave many decades later. Can we just admire how awesome that cover story was though? They were really, like, we'll just say the bears got him, if anyone asks. And legit stuck to the story. 4 years ago my dad passed away in an accident. It totally broke my mom and siblings. He and I never really got along, so I was sad, but didn't take it nearly as hard as my family. A year after he passed, my mom gave me his old desktop when my computer died. I found out that he'd been cheating on my mom for years when I stumbled onto the folder where he saved every chat log, picture, video, etc. Most of them were only online, but he met up with one woman while he was out of town for work. I've never told my family, and don't think I ever will. Late Buto vertical bar. My great uncle shot himself in the head with a hunting rifle right before his kids walked in the door from school. His suicide letter said he wanted them to find him so they could know how much they ruined his life. They were very young at the time he died and no one knew about the letter until our great aunt died many years later. It was a whole new layer of hurt for the kids to find the letter. My great aunt and uncle never had kids, so they treated me and my siblings like their grandkids. My aunt died 10 years ago this year. So I was looking up her grave site so I can visit and saw a suggested link to a page about the grave of her child. I was very confused because I always just assumed they didn't want kids. Turns out they had a son who only lived to be a few months old. Made me sad to think that they did want kids and either couldn't or wouldn't after their son died. I met all 4 of my mom's boyfriends at her funeral. It was a surprise to them and myself. We found a sex swing in my little Catholic grandmother's attic. My mom didn't want me after I was born. She tried to give me away to my aunt, the only person she trusted with me. My grandfather told me that the night after her funeral that morning. My aunt confirmed a few days later. Wouldn't take it to heart, dude. My partner had depression after our son was born and used to think that someone else should have him because she wasn't good enough. Year later she is heaps better, regrets her thinking, but it was depression which you can't blame. My Uncle Jack was a quiet, mild-mannered man with a good sense of humor. He looked like a slightly shorter, slightly slimmer Burl Ives. He was a successful psychiatrist, highly respected in his field. Turns out he was also an OS agent during WW2. He never told anyone anything about what he did in the war. His 2 sons, an attorney and an army ranger, both asked him about it, and he wouldn't tell them a word. I found out my boyfriend cheated on me after he died. The only reason I found out is because the girl was bragging on Facebook about how she was the last person who got to taste his junk. I called her a liar, and she posted pics for proof. Shocked me for sure. That's so ed up and trashy. I took care of my dad before he passed, and also handled his finances afterwards. I'm the youngest of 4. Come to find out my parents were divorced well before I would have been conceived. That plus the fact that I have blonde hair and blue eyes and all my siblings have dark hair and brown eyes pretty much got the ball rolling, and I started to ask questions of my mother and other family members. Mom initially denied it, but after I came back with ancestry results showing another man was my biological father, she came clean. My dad gave up a 100% fellowship for a math PhD in order to work to provide for an unanticipated pregnancy, me. He really wanted to teach, and he was a natural. In the 60 years I knew him, he never mentioned the PhD or fellowship opportunity. Not once. I found out going through his papers after his death. My grandmother committed suicide when my dad was a kid. I found out when I saw her death certificate years after, when I was in high school. My wife's dad passed away over 10 years ago. Growing up she had 2 half-brothers. Her mom had been married twice before she married my wife's dad. Last year during all the initial COVID lockdown she decided to finally go through all the family photos that she had gotten from her parents over the years. Her mom was moved into a memory care unit for dementia a couple of years ago. She's identifying family members and reaching out to them on Facebook offering them copies of photos they are in, if they want them. But there's one picture of her and a boy who appears to be a couple of years older that she can't identify. So she starts asking the various relatives that she's contacted. One of them tells her that he's her half-brother. A half-brother she had no idea that she had until that very moment, when she instantly remembered a comment her dad had made when she was very young. Turns out he lives 20 minutes away from us. She found him on Facebook and reached out to him. They spent several days texting back and forth. Turns out his mother wanted nothing to do with my wife's dad after they were divorced and didn't want him around his son. Rather than fight her, my wife's dad just stopped seeing his boy. After corresponding for a couple of weeks, he and his son stopped by our house to say hello. We all get along very well. He and I text pretty often because we both have ordered Broncos that we are waiting for. My wife and him text at least weekly as well. We've been out to dinner with them and are talking about going on a trip together soon. My step-grandfather was a child molester. He molested my cousin. My mom and my aunt covered it up and never told my grandmother. *EDITED, to make it a little more clear. Sorry for the confusion. Created a throwaway for this. When I was 16, my mother and I were living in poverty. The lease on our home was coming up and wasn't going to be renewed. The new landlords wanted to make some desperately needed repairs on the house, as it had never once passed a single inspection from the day we moved in. We had nowhere else to go. Out of the blue, my mother's uncle, my great uncle, showed up and offered to let us come live with him. He'd been my mother's favorite uncle when she was growing up, but they lost touch before I was even born. It turns out, he lived only a few short hours away and was in need of some live-in help. His health was bad and deteriorating. My mother took care of him, driving him to doctor's appointments, helping him after surgeries, etc. For years, she did this, and in return he took care of not only her, but me and even some friends of mine. He and my mother were the kindest, most generous souls I'd ever met, and for the longest time, I told everyone he was like the father I never had. He died right after Christmas some 14 years later, within a week of my 30th birthday, as it happened. He went into the hospital on my birthday, and less than a week later he was gone. It was one surgery too many, and he didn't have the strength to pull through. I stayed with my mother for as long as I could, trying to help her figure out what her next steps would be. He'd had a will, leaving her everything. His house, his bank accounts, all of it. But the will was gone. No one knew where it went. We searched high and low, but never found it. What I did find, however, was a marriage certificate. My mother was married to her uncle, and had been for over a decade. You see, he went into the hospital for surgery one day, and in the process, the doctors realized he'd need a second surgery. Instead of keeping him under, they had to let him come out of it, and become coherent enough to consent to the second surgery. As his niece, my mother didn't have a say in that. Why not simply make her power of attorney? He had amazing health insurance and retirement. By becoming his wife, she was able to be put on his health insurance. She was getting older, they were roughly a decade apart in age, and needed healthcare, dental, and vision. She was also the beneficiary of his life insurance after his death, as well as his social security and veterans benefits, thus ensuring that she was taken care of long after he passed. I was never able to call him my stepfather in life, because I never knew. My mother was always afraid I wouldn't understand, or that I'd judge. Their relationship wasn't physical. My mother is a CSA survivor, and is repulsed by sex, and his health was too poor and his medications too severe for him to be able to do anything of the sort. I understand why they didn't tell me, because I hesitate to tell other people. It's not a dark secret or anything I'm ashamed of, because I knew the nature of their relationship wasn't like that. But it's definitely something that requires explanation, and it's hard to tell how someone's going to take it. A lot of these are truly upsetting, but I have a cool shocking story. I knew my grandfather was in the armed forces in the early 60s, but I did not know that one time Martin Luther King visited. No clue why he visited an army base in the middle of a civil rights movement, but whatever, and my grandfather was the only white guy on the Alabama base that greeted him, and shook his hand, and who asked not a general or something that had to. When I heard this story I was like, no. I'm way but fairer as a photograph. Grandpa shaking hands with MLK. Amazing. Wished he or someone had told me that when he was still alive. I found this all out when I asked my father about the history of mental illness in our family when I was diagnosed bipolar last year. He said we had none, but my aunt said, Donna, do you remember when mom went away? My dad and aunts did not know what had happened exactly. My oldest aunt, let's call her Mary, she would have been 12 or so then, remembers the most, and said it started when grandma had come home from work, when they were making berry smoothies in a blender, and grandma was convinced that it was my toddler Uncle's brains in the blender, despite him sitting there in the kitchen with them, alive and well. She started screaming at them about how evil they were, and shaking him, and trying to get him to wake up, even though he was crying and screaming. At some point she grabbed a knife, and was chasing them with it. Mary somehow got all the little ones, and went to a neighbor's a ways down the road, middle of the country, until their dad came home. Mary met him at the driveway, and explained what happened, and he told her to stay at the neighbor's, until he came back. They were there a few days when someone from the state came and got them. My dad and the 2 older girls were put in foster care, and the 2 younger ones went to some family. Almost a year went by, and then, one day, they were all brought back together, and given back to grandma, who they had not heard from the entire time, but their dado vertical bar was just gone. Turns out after he put her away, he just moved away, and left them all. She refused to talk about what happened, and they all eventually found out through another family member. You've been visited by the ghost of a very important man. Pay your respects by liking and subscribing, and he'll grant you 3 weeks of good luck.